Welcome to the High Capacity Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Chan, a fellow at Brookings. I'm thrilled to be joined today by my guest, Afra Wang, an absolutely brilliant writer focused on China's tech culture and broader cultural trends in China and the US. She's the author of the amazing Concurrent newsletter and host of the popular Cyberpink podcast, which is in Chinese. She's currently joining from London, where she's also a fellow with GovAI. Welcome, Afra, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Kyle.
So I want to start by asking a big question, which is, what is Chinese tech culture? So like in Silicon Valley, we hear about like hoodies and tech bros and billionaire founders with big egos who love to move fast and break things. In China, from an American perspective, like we do hear a bit about the 996 work culture, this sort of like work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, relentless sort of bring your mattress to work sort of culture.
Yeah.
But beyond that, what's Chinese tech culture actually like, right? Like, is there even such a thing? Like, how does it compare to Silicon Valley? Are there tech bros in China? So maybe start there.
Yes, there are a lot of tech bros in China, I would say. If there's one thing similar is between Silicon Valley and China is the density of tech bros. Although they sort of like, they're broy in a very different manners. We can talk about it later. I think this is a really broad question. It's a great question. When you ask, what is China's tech culture, I think it is, I don't even know where to start. I can break it down through this founder's archetype, through, generations, through different regions. There's like a Shenzhen founder versus a Beijing founder. They're all like in very different personalities and in really different backgrounds. But I think in general, there are some patterns I can map it out for you. I think the first one is engineer realism. And I honestly, I do think, Kyle, I think your newsletter High Capacity is like a reflection of this engineering realism, that, like all sorts of industries converge together and that produced, very tangible, touchable, products. And I think this product first, shipping first, philosophy later, virtue is something that Chinese tech culture appreciates. There's intense focus on execution, on shipping, on iteration, and on scalability. And honestly, I think anyone who constantly talking about philosophy, who constantly, tweeting or posting on social media would be slightly looked down upon by the Chinese tech people, because people values doing rather than talking. I do think there's like a really strong sense of 务实 instead of 务虚. 务实 means like minding the substance, and 务虚 means minding the philosophicals, minding the intangibles. And then I think the other aspect is the hyper-competitive mindset. When I was reading Li Kai-fu's 2018 book about, I think the name is AI Superpower, although in Chinese translation it's translated in a less hawkish name. Li Kai-fu would use Wang Xing, the Meituan's founder, as example to educate his fellow Silicon Valley readers. Be like, look at people like Wang Xing. They're no less smarter than you. But yet they are fighting like 100 times more brutal than you. And if a Silicon Valley founders could be driven by ideals, could all the time, like, talking about changing the world, then, Li Kai-fu said the Chinese founders they don't have this luxury. And if we really trace back to the history of the internet, you will see like a lot of pivotal moments are being named by wars. For example, 百团大战, right? Like the 100 regiment battle, like that was the moment when, like Meituan, and the Didi and, all the other, mobile first applications are trying to, take control of the market and kill each other. And right now we're actually in another sort of 百团大战, the 100 regiment battle, with AI. Right now is a Spring Festival. So this is like the moment where, everyone would be on their smartphones sending messages to each other. And this is another pivotal moment for AI companies to, sending subsidies, doing like all sorts of promotional messages during the Spring Festival Gala to take control of the market. And then I do think there's a mindset that when it comes to this subsidy war is if I dare to lose 2 arms, then I can win I can win over someone who only dared to lose 1 arm. There's like this sort of absolutely like this self-sacrificing, like I'm willing to I'm willing to double down more. I'm willing to kill more resources. I'm willing to sacrifice more short-term interest just to gain like a long-term longevity sort of mindset. This is like really brutal. Like if you really read about the history and not like seeing the current competition going on. And another, I think, really interesting aspect is I think people often underestimate how past dependent Chinese tech culture is on Gaokao, on the Chinese, basically like the Chinese college entrance examination. I think it's just like how a Silicon Valley founder is like essentially replicating the sort of the college application, telling your story well kind of culture. I think the Chinese tech culture is running on this science experimental class culture, which combined with extreme meritocracy. So Gaokao, the college entrance exam, is essentially a resource allocation system. And people who excel in this resource allocation system, people who can, get themselves into the top 1% of Gaokao, the rest of their lives, they're trying to replicate their success. They're trying to sort of extract the magic potion that let them win the Gaokao and then drink this magic potion over and over again when they're like facing all sorts of obstacles or difficulties when they're trying to expand their company. So I think such DNA really pushed the founder forwards. And I think one interesting feature is, a lot of Chinese tech companies are extremely good at winning the benchmarks and excelling on different AI leaderboards. And I think this is such a Gaokao thing because, Gaokao is a system where it has a very clear reward and scoring system. And if you can just follow this system, like if you can follow this like a clarity on what's get reward and what's not get reward, you can win the Gaokao. And then I think people tend to apply this like a clear defined metric to everything in their life. So that's why I think a lot of Chinese tech people are being blamed for lacking humanities, sensibilities, or lacking philosophical frameworks, or just being criticized as not a good public speaker, right? When I was listening to the founder of Minimax on Luo Yonghao's podcast, it is 3-hour long podcast, just like Lex Fridman's podcast. But it was painful to listen Yan Junjie, the Minimax founder, talking to Luo Yonghao because he would mumble a lot. He doesn't really know how to draw an interesting framework to describe the situation Minimax was going through. He lacks this emotional depth to really tell a beautiful founder story. And he just sounds like anyone in my high school, which is semi-elite public high school. And then I've encountered with a lot of this experimental class like people, right? Like he just sounds like them. Sounds like one of them. And I think the next one is the generational divide, where I would argue that China has 4 different generations. And each generation has very distinct culture because they are essentially a product of their time. Actually, it's funny because in Chinese movie ecosystem, people tend to categorize movie directors into different generations. Like Jia Zhangke is the 5th generation, and then Bi Gan is the 6th generation. Zhang Yimou is probably like 3rd generation, and then each generation has a very distinct feature and a theme of stories they're telling. And I think this is such a pliable framework to the tech founders as well. I think there are 4 generations The first generation would be the Ren Zhengfei generation. They are the generation sort of like they spent their formative experiences during the Cultural Revolution. When China started to like reform and open up, they are the ones in the 90s would dare to go into the sea, right? 下海. 下海is previously a derogatory term, like talking about a woman becoming a prostitute, right? Like if you become a prostitute, sell your body, like sell your soul, you're 下海. And that Ren Zhengfei represents this generation who are willing to sort of like stripping away the beautiful socialist idealism and then willing to become a dirty capitalist to 下海. He himself founded Huawei in 1987 after leaving People's Liberation Army. I think this generation really viewed business as warfare. And then they're also the generation experienced real poverty and real struggle, like famine, Cultural Revolution, anti-racist movement. I think Ren Zhengfei's family really got purged during the anti-racist movement. And I think also Ren Zhengfei's this corporate discipline is somehow formed a very like semi-military style. Like there's often like talking about the Huawei army, Huawei Juntuan, and talking about the wolf culture, right? Like Huawei Wang Xing, the wolf spirit. I think like largely because Ren Zhengfei and essentially like Xi Jinping, they're in the same generation. So their worldview is like really shaped by Maoism. Like Mao loves the military styled like vocabularies, right? Like Mao often referred to different things as struggle, as, revolution, as fights. But I think, Ren Zhengfei is, I think I'm oversimplifying Ren Zhengfei here. Ren Zhengfei is also a deeply, deeply westernized person, like at his core. And Huawei, I would argue, like Huawei, although it looks like a very sort of like Chinese, like the most Chinese company from outside, Huawei is actually more internationalized than a more modern looking company like Tencent. So Huawei has more international branches than Tencent. Tencent is actually very 土, like, very, how to say, like domestic.
Yeah.
But like actually Huawei is more 洋气, more foreign than Tencent in many aspects, like the amount of foreigners they hire, how the company essentially operated based on like IBM's organizational system. But sorry for the little tangent. The next one is the Jack Ma generation, I would argue. They are the generation matured in the early 2000s when China entered WTO and the global capital flooded in. Like Jack Ma sort of built Alibaba during the honeymoon between US and China. And there is this like a beautiful synergy between the globalization and the economically booming China and the booming internet culture. So Jack Ma himself absorbed a lot of Silicon Valley optimism and although, he also really attached to Hangzhou and draw deeply like onto the local tradition. Like Jack Ma is someone who would just perform like a rock star on the stage, talk about the grand ideas, talk about there's like no ceiling, could limit Alibaba's growth like any Silicon Valley founders we're familiar with. And I think Jack Ma's generation really represents like the most romantic, the most globalized, the most innovative period of the Chinese internet history, which is part of my core memory. Like I was a kid when people like Jack Ma were the heroes, in China. So they certainly embody certain openness to the world, and I think alongside with Jack Ma's generation, you have Pony Ma from Tencent, you have Robin Li from Baidu, you have Zhou Hongyi from Qihu 360, you have Lei Jun from Xiaomi, and you have many other, like a lot of the big names sort of emerged from this generation. And then the other generation sort of built the Chinese digital infrastructure.
Yeah.
next, we're sort of slowly moving towards the 2010s, and that's when the Jiang Zemin generation really emerged. I think they're the decade of mobile internet. So this is a decade when majority of Chinese people experience internet for the first time. So like when people were on desktops, not a lot of people could afford a desktop. So like for my grandma, my aunts, my auntie's husbands, like their generation, they really first plugged into the internet with their smartphones. You know, they aren't the people who would buy, who would just, buy a laptop or buy a computer, right? And then, so the Jiang Zemin generation came in and see the huge opportunity when essentially like 1.4 billion people were able to access to the internet. Jiang Zemin's ByteDance is emblematic in this generation. They're really good at refining recommendation algorithm. They're really good at building all sorts of mobile apps. Wang Xing at Meituan, right? Chen Wei at Didi. I think they're all, the same generation was Jiang Zemin. They're very sophisticated, and also they're the generation don't really worship or just directly copy the Silicon Valley blueprints anymore. I think they're the practical generation. They're the practical ones. Be like, we're facing this huge, like vast Chinese mobile market where, the Western experience just not really replicable. It's not very practical here. And, they're the ones started to like figure out a lot of methodologies that Silicon Valley started to borrow from. And now we're in the fourth generation, which is the AI and robotic generation of the 2020s. I think they're the new cohort forged in the crucible of US-China technology rivalry because, Trump came to power 2014, and a lot of the sort of the pushbacks and attack on the Chinese tech industry started in 2018. They're the ones sort of like grew up in the reality that U.S. will always try to slow us down, and we shall really grow out of China's tech strength, out of China's advantages. So they're the ones, I think, doing the most impressive things right now. They're the ones, doing semiconductors, AI, autonomous system, new energy, think of Yu Kai of horizontal robotics, Diping Xian, right? Yang Zhilin of Moonshot AI, with impressive Kimi models. You have, Chen Tianshi from Capricorn, which is NVIDIA of China. And you have SenseTime, you have Zhipu AI, you have Wang Xingxing's Unicorn Robotics, you have, like Six Dragon, like A Dragon, like all those interesting little names. And you also have DJI, right? Dajiang, you have Tuozhu, like Bamboo Lab, the leading of 3D printer. Like you have a lot of these, like, I think like a smaller wolf package, leader in like a niche industry.
Yeah. And especially hard tech as well.
Absolutely, especially hard tech. And a lot of them are actually educated in the West, right? Yang Zhilin himself from Moonshot AI, he was educated from CMU, Carnegie Mellon University. He's very bilingual, like very internationalized, and yet he chose to go back to China and start his own company. So I think they're the generation with a lot more confidence on themselves and with a much stronger China tech ecosystem, so they can sort of grow out their unique company that could combine the best of the both worlds. I think Yang Zhilin is actually a perfect example. So I think, this is still, I know I talked a lot, but this is a very brief tour of China's tech community. You mentioned that, we know BAT, right? ByteDance, Alibaba, Tencent, Huawei. And actually there's like a newer syncronym called, TMD. It's Total, it's Meituan and Didi, and the TMD companies represents like this more generational shift. They are more innovative, focus on AI. They're newer. They capture like specific consumer needs.
Yeah. No, that's amazing. This is fantastic. Boy, I could just type up what you just said and print that out, and that could be like like a really awesome piece right there. I mean, it's so interesting to see the story of China's tech development through these generations of founders to see the evolution, both like what they focus on,
Right.
this shift towards especially more hard tech stuff, and also more technical founders, these like young geniuses who were at the top of their class and are the ones who maybe wrote some of the original code or started to build. And then at the same time, their kind of position in society changing. And I was wondering actually if you could talk a little bit about like that. Like are Chinese tech founders like worshipped like they are in the US, like the way that people, including actually also in China, like look up to Elon Musk or, Sam Altman, and how they become these like heroes for many people. Like, is that kind of a thing in China, or is there sort of a different position that they occupy in society? And then also, how do they kind of navigate the world of geopolitics, of being worried about like being patriotic enough, right, to satisfy Beijing, but also maybe a little bit worried about being sanctioned from the US and trying to navigate like domestic politics, international politics, sort of all of that. Yeah.
I do think the crackdown of Jack Ma changed the Chinese tech culture in a very profound way. I think before, you still have tech celebrities like Jack Ma would, in public, sort of criticize the Chinese banking system and trying to found, Hupan 大学, Xihu University to really cultivate a group of Chinese tech entrepreneurs who are well-spoken, who are charismatic, who are philosopher kings, and can really sort of have the production force to change society in a not just in technology, but ideologically. But I think after the purge of Jack Ma, not really. I think this whole worshipping tech founder thing has been complicated by the state's ambivalence about celebrity entrepreneurs. I think essentially the state sees Jack Ma as a threat. And it is a process of taming the Jack Ma class. And, there's a phrase called 杀鸡儆猴, right? You kill the chicken to tame the monkeys. I think, and now people, the tech entrepreneurs, the founders in China, learned from this, and they became much more low-key, and they tweet less. I used to really like reading Wang Xing and Zhang Yiming's Weibo and whatever, their social media, and people just don't speak up anymore. And that's why I constantly go back to the archive of, Wang Xing's Fanfo or Zhang Yiming's Weibo, and then just really get me a sense of, what was like back then when tech founders could be, in a sense, leading or expressing their, certain topics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think right now, entrepreneurs and the state have a very interesting equilibrium. And also, I do think this is a constant push and pull a play where entrepreneurs are being told that you're a useful servant of national development. But also, the Chinese tech founders are trying like all sorts of ways to gain global influence. I do think it's really complicated, and also it's divided by generations, divided by the industries. For example, the two consumer AI founders are more willing to sort of sever the tie and with the Chinese state and do a bunch of geopolitical arbitrage, such as just moving their entire headquarters to Singapore or to the US so they can get proper funding from Silicon Valley. And some tech founders, when you're doing semiconductors, when you're doing robotics, it's just a lot more beneficial if you stay in China and enjoy the complete supply chain and enjoy the state subsidy and also enjoy the status of being celebrated as a national hero because, in some way, those people boost up China's tech sovereignty. Like right now, today is Chinese New Year, right? Wang Xingxing's Unitree Robotics, it is their third time being on Chinese Spring Gala, the Super Bowl of China, right? One of the most viewed Chinese TV program. And Wang Xingxing, to some extent, he is a national hero and he is being worshipped and celebrated. I think it is. Yeah, it's really, I think, depends on like which industry and which generation you're in.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I mean, it's like, when you are sort of in line with the national program, when you are not too outspoken and sticking your neck out, maybe when you're on some podcasts, but not too many, not every podcast talking about AGI, then you kind of are in that sweet spot where you can actually do pretty well, but not incur the wrath or the sort of the strike back of the state, as it were. Yeah. Well, I want to pivot to a piece that you wrote that sort of I found like so fascinating, and I mean it's like one of a number of pieces you wrote recently that I think really took off. And this is the China tech canon. So you wrote this for Asterisk magazine, I believe, and I was just wondering if you could talk about sort of like what is the China tech canon? What are these books that Chinese sort of tech entrepreneurs are reading? What influences China's tech community, and does it overlap with the Silicon Valley canon of books? Is it totally different? And how does that feed into like their differing sorts of worldviews or attitudes towards technology?
That's a great question. I think part of my obsession is the different cognitive frameworks that sort of like operates in Silicon Valley and operates in China. So last year, I started to read a series of articles, initiated by people like Patrick Collison on Silicon Valley canon. So when I was reading the Silicon Valley canon book list, I was like, oh my God, a lot of those Silicon Valley canons are actually just China tech canon, because those are the books that, Lei Jun and Zhang Xiaolong, the father of WeChat, like Wang Xing, the founder of Meituan, would just recommend people to read. And I just see a big overlap, between the Silicon Valley canon and the China tech canon. And then reversely, I was thinking, if people are so fond of understanding what ideas are driving Silicon Valley founders, if they're interested in the philosophy of Silicon Valley, then what's the Chinese counterpart? So I started to think like this question nonstop. And the first story came to me is I love Xiaomi as a company, and I love reading all sorts of stories about Lei Jun. I probably read like 3, biographies about Lei Jun already, and some other books about Xiaomi. There's one story that Lei Jun keeps telling his audience and keeps telling the media is he really started to dream about opening a company, like be a founder, because when he was a college student in Wuhan University back in 1987, he read a book called 硅谷之火, Fire in the Valley. And this is a book about how, the 1970s homebrewed agriculture sort of took over Silicon Valley, and companies like Microsoft, Apple, IBM all sort of brewed from this like geeky, hacker culture in Silicon Valley. And then like the heroes like visionaries like Steve Jobs sort of all come from this particular phenomenon, this branch. And Lei Jun read the book, and as a 21-year-old college student, he fall into the most excited insomnia in his life. He just couldn't sleep, and he was like running in the school playground because he was just like way too excited. He wanted to do something like that. Really, the book really fueled his imagination of what you could do. And later, like Lei Jun is famously known as constantly mimicking Steve Jobs, by wearing black turtleneck or by having a nickname called 雷布斯, right? It's literally like a combination of Lei Jun and Steve Jobs, 乔布斯. So, and stories like this are everywhere among the Chinese founders. Like many people, they started to fall in love with technology, started to think about becoming a tech founder because they were inspired by Silicon Valley. So what I discovered is there's a huge overlap between the Chinese tech, the China tech canon and the Silicon tech canon is because Chinese founders are absolutely voraciously consuming the Silicon Valley texts, the Silicon Valley Holy Bibles, for example, like I can just name a few, right? Like Wang Xing from Meituan, he loves Peter Thiel's 0 to 1, and he just constantly asking his employees about, like what is something true, but most of people think it's not true. Like what is your contrarian idea, right? This is such a like Peter Thiel coded question, and then Wang Xing's entire sort of mindset of driving Meituan to be a gigantic super app in delivery is because Wang Xing believes in monopoly, which is exactly what Peter Thiel believes in. Peter Thiel he doesn't believe in competition. He thinks a great company should create one's own niche and then just become the monopoly. This is exactly what Wang Xing did. And for WeChat's father, Zhang Xiaolong, who used to be the program manager for Foxmail, and who were, such a, like, also, I would say a more philosopher, king type-ish, a tech giant. He loves Kevin Kelly's Out of Control, which is a book written in the 90s, a quite obscure book essentially about technology has its own will. Technology has its own trajectory, and we're, in a sense, having a more symbiosis relationship with technology, not like the human control technology-ish relationship. And Zhang Xiaolong would ask all the WeChat PMs to read Kevin Kelly's Out of Control and say, if you don't read this book, you're not qualified to become a PM. So I find this so interesting. And, like it comes to other things, right? Like, Ben Horowitz, The Hard Thing About Hard Things. I remember Robin Lee talked about, he was reading the book and felt strongly resonate with it. He almost cried. And also, Ray Dalio's Principles, is also widely read by Chinese business leaders, not just tech leaders. And James Collins' Built to Last, the Lean Startup. These are all Silicon Valley classics, but they are more widely read in China than anywhere else. Peter Thiel's 0 to 1 sold more copies in China than the West. And Elon Musk's Elon Musk's 2013 biography written by
Ashley Vance?
Ashley Vance, written by Ashley Vance, sold so many copies because I specifically remember I was a college student back then. I was in Beijing during the summer break, and I was just in Beijing. I was in the Beijing subway, line number 4. Line number 4 is like famous, is a famous Beijing subway line for connecting all the best universities in Beijing. So like this is a line where the most tech workers would take. I just remember walking into like line 4, and it's Elon Musk's face everywhere, is because that's the advertisement for the Elon Musk's biography, 硅谷钢铁侠, the Iron Man from Silicon Valley. And it was such a like impactful moment because I think it was 2014 when China just started when China seriously started its endeavor into EV, when everyone laughed at Chinese, like basically Chinese car manufacturing industry, because BYD back then was a joke. Like Geely back then was laughable because they couldn't design a beautiful car. They're like often copy others. They didn't have a strong brand. They were just cringe. And then in 2014, like just imagining how many people who were working on subway line for going to all sorts Chinese tech companies would read Elon Musk's book and then started to think, I could build my own EV company. I could jump into this really nascent industry. I could be China's Iron Man, right? Mm-hmm. So I think moments like this really taught me the lesson that a lot of the Silicon Valley ideologies, the successful stories, the romanticism, the hacker culture, the homebrew computer club energy actually is the core of China's tech ecosystem. But also, I added that there's also a big asymmetry between Silicon Valley and China is when Chinese founders voraciously consuming Silicon Valley's holy Bibles, Silicon Valley doesn't do the other way around. That's why it creates a lot of cognitive gap. So I would argue that there's another different set of Chinese tech canon that's less visible to Silicon Valley, which I would argue I just name it randomly. I said it's called red canon and gray canon. The reason why it's called red canon is because I realized apart from Chinese tech founders constantly parroting their Silicon Valley counterparts about ideals, about changing the world, about using technology for good, sometimes they use very, very pragmatic messages, just like Maoist verbatim. And sometimes Maoist texts are being read as tactical manuals. There's a big culture, actually a big culture among Chinese tech founders to read the classics, the classic essays by Mao, especially during the earlier, the founding period of the Communist Party, when the CCP was an underdog, when nobody knew what was going on. And, in a sense, Mao had such a clarity and conviction about the party's ideals and the party's goal. And Mao later was being called as the greatest entrepreneur in the Chinese history because essentially, revolution is entrepreneurship. Forging a party spirit is almost like building a company and create a company culture. So many people would read Mao's stuff just because it is so illuminating from organizational and culture building aspect. And of course, Mao himself is really creative of inventing many easy to understand vocabularies and can really quickly to go through the essence of things. So Mao is also being seen as a great communicator. So people, especially Ren Zhengfei and earlier tech founders would constantly use Maoist language. So at the same time, China actually operates in a much pyramid-like structure. You have the rich bourgeoisie's, big city dwellers, who would, order, who would consume luxury goods and, order expensive stuff, on Taobao. But you also have a vast amount of rural area where, they would call 下沉市场, the downward, the trickle down market. And then this market is often being seen as seized by companies like Pinduoduo. And the way Pinduoduo conquered this trickle down or this rural region is constantly being seen as Mao's strategy of circling the rural area and surpass the city. So that was the big tactic. That's why CCP ended up won the civil war and the Kuomintang didn't win, was because Mao sort of saw the potential of the rural area of the peasants. And then Pinduoduo, in a sense, right, PDD, did really well in terms of, making the items on their platforms extremely cheap and be able to really, build an extensive supply chain and deliver, everything like into the farthest corner of the Chinese rural area and the little towns, which basically has the majority of the Chinese population. So people would constantly refer the Maoist strategy when they need to do a lot of grassroots organizational mobilization, right? Like how you can make sure Alibaba's Afu, this AI medical application, how do you basically let the rural elderlies who needed this app most to know this app, right? And then this is essentially like a massive mobilization effort, which, could basically trace down to Maoist strategy. And next, I would argue there's something called gray canon, is because when I was reading a lot of Chinese tech founders' autobiography, or when they're, writing forwards to other people's books, they constantly mention, they would read Confucius or Taoist were like legalist, those basically China's Confucius classics or Chinese Taoist classics like Dao De Jing. I think all the founders would experience certain existential moments or spiritual crisis. I think the Chinese founders are more likely to turn to the ancient classics, the Taoist, the Confucius classics, rather than anything else. So I do see like a lot of tech founders, they just started to read Wang Yangming's 心学, the philosophy of the heart. And it is basically a self-help book and a motivational text when a tech founder is in certain dilemma or need to handle very complicated stuff, or just, experiencing life itself, right? So in the West, we see, Gary Tan would advise the tech founders to read, Carl Jung, to discover your shadow, right? And then to go to therapy, to heal your relationship with your family, so you can be a proper founder. You can be more responsible for your employees. You can basically put yourself out there. You can be a capable founder. And then in China, people do emphasize mental health, but a lot of people just like turn to classic texts for strength. And I would say the Confucius Analect, 论语, is one of the best self-help books ever. It is like, when I was reading it, I really gained so much strength from it. It is essentially a text about dignity, about sense-making, about how to treat others, about what your value is. And just by reading it, you just feel like you're filled with this like righteous and bright energy in you. And I can totally see like so many tech founders would turn to Confucius just for self-help.
Yeah, yeah.
And also I do think there is a deeper like philosophical underlayer of the Chinese society, like just look at the Chinese bureaucratic system and like some fundamental logic that runs the Chinese society. And many of them are essentially need to trace back to the Confucius, to the Taoist, the legalist texts from 2,000 years ago. It's just like when the Silicon Valley tech founders, like, we need to talk about philosophical stuff, it is essentially like the ancient Greek, ancient Rome texts and those philosophies. So I think it's the same. Like, eventually you will know that we're all ended up adding more footnotes to Confucius texts, and just like we're adding more footnotes to Plato, right?
Yeah.
So I do think if you want to understand how to survive in the Chinese society, if you want to understand the statecraft, if you want to understand the bureaucratic system, if you want to understand like honor, dignity, sense making, like everything, you kind of need to go back to this gray canon. What I call gray is, is because I guess like gray just represents this big, undefined yet essential area, like in the tech space. And also, I want to color code this just for fun. and then I think lastly I mentioned there's also mythological readings, just like how Silicon Valley founders are obsessed with tokens or sci-fis. Chinese tech founders, the Chinese tech bros, tech ecosystem also really fond of mythologies and sci-fi. And then the two signature writers, I would say it's Jin Yong and Liu Cixin. And Jack Ma is a massive fan of Jin Yong. So when Jack Ma in the early 2000s, when he wanted to sort of gather a bunch of people to create certain momentum for Alibaba, he would create a tech conference called 西湖论剑, like, how to translate is like, the swordsmanship competition next to the West Lake. And the 西湖论剑 is such a Jin Yong coded thing. And Jack Ma himself repetitively saying, without Mr. Jin Yong, there wouldn't be Alibaba as a company, is because Jin Yong's world fueled so much like romanticism and heroism into Jack Ma's mind. And Jack Ma essentially see the tech world as a jianghu. And now I totally see tech world as a jianghu as well. So in Alibaba, a distinctive culture is like people call each other's nicknames, right? And Jack Ma, himself, his nickname is Feng Qingyang. Feng Qingyang is in, I think in Jin Yong's 笑傲江湖, in that novel, Feng Qingyang is the greatest martial art swordsman who achieved the highest level of like the swordsmanship, but ended up becoming a secluded, like a person, and then left all the reputation and the glory behind, and then basically just disappeared. And I think this sort of represents how Jack Ma would want to see himself, right? As Jack Ma would constantly, naming different branches of Alibaba into Jin Yong's mythological names, and Jack Ma also named different offices according to Jin Yong Cosmos locations, right? His own office is called Taohua Dao, the Peach Blossom Island. Taohua Dao is owned by, in Jin Yong's book, it's owned by someone called Master Huang, and Master Huang is a tactic mathematician who is really good at building maze to confuse people who wanted to visit the Peach Blossom Island. And Master Huang is also really arrogant and, like looked down on like everyone else in the Jianghu. But also Master Huang has the most, righteous and the sense of justice, and, willing to sacrifice his own life to save his daughter or his wife. And, like Master Huang embodies this Confucius, and, a combination of a Confucius and a Taoist master. And I think maybe Jack Ma see a lot of himself in Master Huang, and that's why he named his office as Peach Blossom Island. Later he opened up his university, which is essentially like a martial arts master opening up one's clan, right? Like, try to recruit people into his clan and then build something. So another I think essential text to understand the Chinese tech landscape would be Liu Cixin's three-body problem. Liu Cixin's three-body problem is so influential to the point that there are management theories named after the dark forest theory. There are like so many terms in Liu Cixin's three-body problem became a business term, or became a term people just describe business scenarios, like, the chain of suspicion, like the diminishing dimension to attack, or people would refer to certain business strategy, based on the plots of three-body problems. So like three-body problems basically provides a perfect sort of popular cultural reference pool for people to draw like really imaginary and creative references from. and you instantly understand, like, what do you mean by that? And then there's a way to, describe this really cutthroat competition and strategic opacity. And then like people would refer to, we're in a dark forest, and if you don't hit the sniper, if the sniper don't, if you don't kill the sniper, you will end up being killed by the snipers hiding in the dark. And so, yeah, together, I think Jin Yong and Liu Cixin gave the Chinese technologists more imaginative toolkits. I think they function kind of like how Tolkien and Asimov sort of function in Silicon Valley. I think it is really like, I think Liu Cixin and Jin Yong and, many other like popular cultural references made Chinese tech ecosystem more vibrant, more colorful, and more humanistic.
Yeah. It's super interesting. I mean, the way that these texts reflect a number of different attitudes, and then are then the foundation for a common language, a common maybe approach to tackling both the like pragmatic business strategy questions, but also like sort of this introspection as well, at a more sort of like deeper sort of cultural level.
Yeah.
And related to this, I was wondering if you could talk about another text that you wrote about for Wired magazine, the Morning Star of Lingao, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this interesting, like fascinating crowdsourced sci-fi novel that's online, something like millions of words now have been contributed to this. And the way that in a nutshell, I believe the story is basically, a group of time travelers goes back to the Ming Dynasty and essentially is trying to like help China industrialize, maybe before the West, and this sort of like alternative history. And I was just wondering if you could talk about, the significance of this text, this like incredible sort of like group collectively created text, and what it says about Chinese attitudes towards technology and industry and some of these big topics now.
I think this piece is actually more of a historical probe. I'm trying to really like take the audience as well as myself travel back to 2006, the early 2010s, and I really to understand what was the fabric of the Chinese society and the discussion on the internet. And one thing is quite distinctive is when you're going back to the forums, the variety of cyberspaces in the Chinese internet, you will know like people were predominantly talking about politics, which is quite contrarian to today's understanding. You're not allowed to talk about politics, but there used to be a very vibrant and very intense and very intellectual Chinese internet where people talk about not everything but just politics. And I do think the Morning Star of Lingao is an experiment on people's political imagination. So I actually, the past week, I interviewed one of the core writer of Lingao.
Oh, yeah.
His name is Ma Qianzu. And the way he described to me, I think it actually gave me a lot more understanding of why he wanted to participate in this collective science fiction writing about, kickstarted industrial revolution in the Ming Dynasty was essentially because he was not happy with, he was very unsatisfied with both China's hard power and soft power at the time. And he was also really frustrated with China's leadership. And he do believe if you can sort of create a vacuum world and you let the people who understands the highest form of productivity force, you can basically build a better political structure, you can have a better regime, you can build a more ideal society. So it was essentially, according to Ma Qianzu, a political imagination experimentation. And I think this is really interesting. And So for people who don't know, like the Morning Star of Lingao was essentially written by many people like Ma Qianzu. So Ma Qianzu himself was a civil engineer at Suzhou Planning and Design Research Institute. So when he was writing about Morning Star of Lingao, he really injected a lot of his own worldview as well as working experiences when he was basically one of the pillars that built today's modern China. There's very distinct yearning for those writers, which is they see building things, they see industrialization have the ultimate righteousness. And they're quite teleological about the progression of things. So Ma Qianzu and many Lingao writers themselves are like hardcore Marxist. So later, this group of people, they essentially formed a loosely connected intellectual group called the Industrial Party, which was coined by another nationalist scholar, Wang Xiaodong. And it was because this Industrial Party is essentially posing some challenging voice against predominantly back then what Wang Xiaodong would call the sentimental party. And I would say they sounded like today's like more leftist intellectuals who would somehow promote certain like degrowth ideologies. You know, like they would argue that, if a high-speed rail, like a train accident happened, maybe the nation should halt and stop this rapid development and then like really figure out what we want to do. Like, you know, if certain rapid development of the Chinese society causing a lot of harms to a certain group of people, maybe we should reconsider this. And then the Industrial Party people back then would systematically organize the intellectual rebuttal against the sentimental party.
So they were not a political party, just to be sure. They were kind of a group of people. Yeah.
Yeah, they're just group. They're like, you know, like when you're saying the Silicon Valley AI Twitter, right? Like they're vaguely being called as Industrial Party, but no, there's only one effective party in China. We all know which one is that.
Right.
So the scholar like Wang Xiaodong, the nationalistic scholar who coined the term Industrial Party and Sentimental Party, I think he pointed out something which is essential for Industrial Party ideal, which also relate to, you know, your translated piece about industrial maximalism, is they believe the greatest source of strength, the most fundamental strategic asset that China could have is industrial capacity itself. So the Industrial Party people, like, I think especially understand that industry isn't just factory you can pack and ship elsewhere. It is actually about the tacit embodied knowledge that's deeply embedded in the industrial system itself. It is organizational knowledge. It is the spirit. It is the way to possibly transfuse the knowledge and integrate those knowledge together. So, and then people like Wang Xiaodong back then would argue that we shouldn't envy the Grammys or Apple or the financial system of the US. You know, Wang Xiaodong famously said, let the American people to sing and dance for us. Our country's greatest strength lays on how much copper you melt and, you know, like how much iron you forge. And I think, you know, like this line goes really hard, right? Because I do think we are now living in a world where Wang Xiaodong's prophecy came true, that China has been melting a lot of copper and China has been forging a lot of iron. And China has been building a very complex and comprehensive industrial base. Like United Nations listed out, you know, 419 categories of manufactured good. And I think China has been producing pretty much all of them. And
Mm-hmm.
and then the industrial party and then a lot of the industrial party sort of like leaning policymakers are really proud of this. And then this is essentially, you know, what you would describe as industrial maximalism, right? It is like if you want to approach the superpower status, if you want to build something which is just like America's dollar hegemony or you know, like Middle Eastern's energy reserve. And for China, these strengths comes from the complete supply chain. It comes from the interconnected capacity to build things. And then we're basically now living in a world where seeing the outcome, the fruits out of this decades-long industrial effort. Lin Gao, I think, as a thought experiment, as a collective writing story, it itself is very grassroots. It doesn't necessarily have any political power, but I think it is it crystallizes certain ideal or certain, I would say, collective unconsciousness embedded in the Chinese system, embedded in the Chinese society. And then it was particularly because of this worship on industrialization, this worship on like national manufacturing strength, China was really able to become what it is now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's this idea that, like, now I've been like toying with this sort of term or this phrase, like the revenge of the real of the real world, right? Like, it wasn't so long ago when I think it was Mark Andreessen who wrote or said, like, software will eat the world. And in many ways, he was right? We see the rise of these American tech giants. We see the rise of like digital platforms becoming almost sort of like nation states in their ability to sort of shape the world, shape the rules, govern us, whether we want that or not. And then now, especially sort of like, you know, with supply chain vulnerabilities and trade wars and critical minerals, export controls, semiconductors, like the real world is like come back with a vengeance. And the industrial party folks would argue like, okay, this is where China will thrive because, you know, China has invested in these capabilities that the U.S. sort of let wither away. And yeah, it's sort of interesting that you know, who would not be fond of China's industrial party? Probably a lot of American and European folks worried about trade and manufacturing job loss and things like that. So that would probably fuel their anxieties about, you know, China's intentions for their sort of economic trajectory. But this idea, is so dominant now. Yeah.
I think there's I just remember there's like a certain, I wouldn't say like a status game, but I do think in China, if you work in manufacturing, if you work in sectors like semiconductor or like robotics or drone, like you will be more respected just, you know, by the state, right? Like when you see Xi Jinping invite tech founders together to give them a talk to, you know, those 民营企业家, right? Like this private sector entrepreneurs. Ren Zhengfei and, you know, like the hardware people are sitting like in the middle. And then you will see the in a sense, like the software AI people, you know, Tencent's Pony Ma and, DeepSeek's Liang Wenfeng, they're the ones sitting at the edge. So like just by tracing this hierarchy, you will know like what the state actually value in terms of what sectors brings the most like outcome or brings the most rewards to the state itself. And I also do vividly remember like last year, actually around the Chinese New Year, I was in Xi'an, having, just, you know, touring the city because my cousin and her husband lives in Xi'an, and her husband is about my age, works for a steel like a state-owned steel company, a very prestigious one. And when I was chatting with him about DeepSeek, he would shrug and be like, you know, AI, like, gimmick, like compared to the, like compared to what I'm dealing with, compared to like the amount of steel, the processing amount of stuff I am conducting, like AI is, you know, is is nonsensical. It's for those Beijing, Shanghai, fancy little circle, like little people, like where we're the pillar of the Chinese industrial power. We're the real heroes here. I do think there's like a certain sense that people who work for hardware are being worshipped as heroes. Like if there is any like sort of hierarchy when it comes to prestige.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Yeah, I mean, we kind of come full circle back to some of like the Marxist materialism,
Oh
sort
yeah,
of the roots in the material power, basically as sort of the foundation. But yeah,
I totally agree. Yeah, like for example, Zhang Yiming and Douyin and all those short platform companies, although they're driving the best video generation technologies right now, like they have the best models, Kuling and Sedans recently. Like ByteDance is not very respected, I would say, among the bigger Chinese tech circle, right? ByteDance is essentially seen as the poison of people's mind, the distraction. And Zhang Yiming himself is not very trusted by the state. He was never really invited by the party to attend any like meaningful like conferences, like how how Ren Zhengfei would be invited to.
Yeah.
So I think that's like also an interesting asymmetry, because Silicon Valley only tend to focus on their counterparts, but because Silicon Valley lacks the hardware people, the ones who actually owns the supply chain, they tend to not see the strengths that China had. But like now, I do think the reindustrializing America start to see it, and then Silicon Valley start to catch up. Like when I was reading A16Z's America Dynamism, a lot of those articles and papers almost feel like a reverse engineering what China have, right? Like like they want to reverse engineering BYD's electronic stack, for example. They want to reverse engineer China's advantages in terms of grid capacity, right? Like the amount of high voltage electricity can be transmuted. They want to replicate China's solar cell manufacturing industry. So I think it's really interesting to see that like American dynamism people start to feel the revenge from reality, as you said, and then, like,
right.
and I like started to catch up.
Yeah. It's funny, this sort of like hall of mirrors of like Chinese tech entrepreneurs like admiring, the Silicon Valley greats, but now Silicon Valley, kind of like wondering if they can borrow a page out of the playbook of some of these Chinese tech companies. And yeah, I mean, it's all sort of blending together. Yeah. Well, we could talk for hours. I mean, Afra, you're like amazing, and you're like one of my favorite writers about these topics. And it's just such a huge honor for you to come on the podcast and talk about all these things. So if listeners want to follow your work, how can they find you?
I think the go-to place would be my newsletter on Substack. It's called Concurrent. It is a tech term, but also like essentially I named this newsletter Concurrent because I see China and Silicon Valley as two innovation engines are concurrently creating like essentially really interesting futures. So yeah, Concurrent is my go-to place, but also I freelance with some publications, and then maybe follow my Twitter as well. It's Afra Wang. I think Kyle can link my stuff to the show notes. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, I'll definitely include links. Highly recommend Concurrent. I'll link to your pieces that we mentioned. Thank you, Afra, so much for an amazing conversation.
Yeah, of course, Kyle. I'm also a big fan of you. I love your newsletter, High Capacity. I do think you're one of the writers who really pick up a lot of the the overlapping Chinese tech reality with a lot of clarity and with a lot of authenticity, I would say. Yeah. It's like you're not basically, like it's really easy to go to the China is winning everything sort of clickbaity trope, or going to the China hawkish trope. And I think you have maintained a very authentic presence and voice, and didn't lured by like any of those two camps. So I really respect that.
Thank you. That's very nice of you to say.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we'll wrap up. And if you like this episode, please rate and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. You can find episode transcripts and more information on the High Capacity newsletter at high-capacity.com. I'm your host, Kyle Chan. Thanks for joining, and see you next time.